Welcome back into the simulator series. In today's episode, we are going to be adding in the pet crafting system to our simulator. As always, if you guys do enjoy the video or it does help you out, make sure you smash the like button, also hit the subscribe button, and turn this post notifications on so you get notified every time I upload a brand new episode. I also have a Patreon. If you guys would like to support me and gain access to all the scripts and the game file that I make during this episode, there's a link down below in the description, and you guys go and check that out. With that being said, let's hop right into it. Hopping directly into Studio, the first thing that we're going to do is create the GUI. So inside of our starter GUI, we are going to add a brand new screen GUI, and we're going to rename this to pet crafting. Now, of course, inside of here, we're going to add a frame, and we are going to center this frame. So 0.5 for the anchor point and 0.5 on both the position scales. Then for the size, on the X scale, I'm going to go with 0.345, and on the Y scale, we're going to go with 0.4. So pretty much our standard frame size. Now that we set the size of that, let's go ahead and set the background color, which is going to be a nice little yellow. After that, we want to add in a title text label, but we're just going to take it from one of the many other GUIs that we actually created. So we're going to copy that title text label, and then we're also going to copy that exit button as well, and then we're going to paste that directly inside of the frame by hitting Control Shift and V. Cool, so now that we have both these in here, for the most part the title is pretty good. I might make that just a little bit smaller, and then we're going to set the text to say crafting, and then we might also want to give it a little bit of a stroke, so we're going to set the stroke transparency to probably about 0.7. Now for the exit button, we're just going to resize this a little bit, so I'm just going to make it a little bit less wide, and then I think we might want to move it a little bit further over towards the corner, so we're going to set that to like 0.915, and I think that actually looks pretty good. Next, we'll duplicate the title text label, and we're going to rename this to Subtitle. For the text of this, we're going to say pets needed in all capital letters, and then we just want to move this down a tiny bit. Now, I'm going to resize it sort of a little bit and make it a little bit smaller, and that is actually probably pretty good just like that, so I'm going to leave that for there right now. Then inside of this frame, we're going to add a scrolling frame to this, and we're going to rename that to container. Now for the background color of this, we are going to take the same yellow that we used here, but just make it a little bit darker, so something like that. Let's go ahead and make sure that we set the size of this to scale, and then we can resize this manually. So now we want to pretty much make it the entire width of the frame, but leave a little bit of border on the outside, so I think that looks pretty good, and then I'm going to stretch this all the way down. Now let's go ahead and make sure that we center this on the x-axis, so set that to 0.5 for the anchor point and 0.5 for the scale. Now we have the subtitle. Let's just move this up a tiny bit and to the left, and that looks pretty good as well. Then going back to the container, let's start adjusting some of the properties inside of here. For the scroll bar thickness, we're going to set this to something like 8, and then we also want to set the border size pixel to 0, so we get rid of that black line. Now we'll start working on what's going to go inside of the container. So inside of the container, let's go ahead and throw in a UI grid layout as well as a brand new frame, which we're going to rename to template. Now for the UI grid layout, let's go ahead and play with the cell sizing. I think on the X scale, we're going to set that to 1, and on the Y, we'll set that to 0.1 for right now. Actually, maybe even 0.125. And then let's duplicate this like 2 times so that we can see what the padding will look like. We're going to set that for 0 on the X and 0.05 on the Y for right now. And then let's just kind of keep playing with that number. So 0.015. I think that even looks pretty good just like that. Cool. So now we got the sizing and the spacing set up. Let's go ahead and delete these other templates and just focus on this one. Now inside of this template, we're going to throw in a UI list layout as well as a frame. Now we're going to rename this frame to price, and then we're going to adjust its sizing. On the X scale, we're going to set that to about 0.25, and on the Y scale, we're going to set that to 0.8. Then for the background color, we want to pick this darker yellow right here, and then just make it even darker, so something like that. Next, what we're going to do is duplicate the title text label, and we're going to bring that inside of our price frame. We're then going to rename this to upgrade, and we're actually going to set the text to something like shiny or even golden. We'll also set the text color of this text label to a yellow. So there we go. And then we can mess around with its sizing. Now on the X scale, I'm going to set that to 0.8. And on the Y scale, we'll set that to 0.225. Now that we've done that, I think that text label looks pretty good. So we're going to go ahead and duplicate this and rename it to question. We'll then set the text color to white, as well as setting the text to a question mark. And then we want to center this. So for the position, make sure that everything is set to 0.5, just like that. We could even increase the size of this just a tiny bit on the Y, so maybe 0.3. Because that makes it a little bit bigger. We'll then duplicate the upgrade text label, and we're going to rename this to amount. For the text of this, we're going to set it to something like 99/99, and we want to make sure that the text color is white. We then want this to appear towards the bottom of the GUI. So for the position on the Y scale, we're going to set that to 0.775, and now that's looking pretty good. Now we're pretty much done with making all the text labels. The last thing that we want to do is add a viewport frame to this, and we want to make sure that we position this in the center. So 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, and then for the size, I think the size we might even set the 0.5 as well. Now I'm fine with that. Although it looks small, at least it's centered between those 2 other text labels, so I'm fine with it like that. You might want it to appear a little bit different though, so you of course can resize or position it however you want to. We'll then set the background transparency of this to 1, and then we want to make sure that with the question text label, we actually set the Z index of this to 2. That's to make sure that this question mark appears over top of the viewport frame if the question mark is displayed. Otherwise, it has a chance of appearing below the viewport frame, and then we wouldn't see it at all. Cool, so now that we've done that, we're pretty much done with this price frame right here, and we're actually going to go ahead and duplicate this and rename this to reward. Now, inside of the reward frame, we're going to actually delete the amount text label because we don't need it over here, and then we're going to add in a text button. Now, we're going to rename this text button to craft. For the background color, we're just going to set it to a grayish color for right now. For the text, we are going to say craft, and the text color is, of course, going to be white, as well as it's going to be scaled. For the font, we're going to use our usual Gotham bold, and then, of course, we need to resize this, so let's make sure that it is scaled. So for the size of this on the X scale, we're going to set that to 1, and then on the Y scale, I think we're going to go with 0.225. Now, for the position, all we have to really do is set the Y scale to 0.775, so that appears towards the bottom of our frame. Cool, and now we're pretty much done with creating the reward frame. What we'll then do is inside of the template, we have the UI list layout right here. We then want to set the horizontal and vertical alignment both to center. Now that we've done that, we're going to add an image label inside of here, and we're going to rename this to arrow. Now, the image that we're going to use is just a trade icon right now. We're going to set the background transparency to 1. We want to make sure that we set the scale type to fit, and then we also need to resize this as well. So for the size of this, we're going to set that to 0.3 on the X and 0.8 on the Y scale. Now, we can't actually see this because it's a white arrow, so let's set the background transparency of the template frame to 1 so that we can actually see that arrow. And now this is appearing all the way to the right. What we need to do is adjust the layout order of these different components that are inside of our template. So the layout order for the price can stay at 0. For the reward, this should actually be set to 2. And then for the arrow, this should be set to 1 so that the arrow appears after the price frame, but also before the reward frame. Cool. So now that we've done that, that's looking pretty good. And we can also duplicate the template frame a couple of times just to see what it might look like. And I believe that looks pretty nice. So we're going to delete the 2 extras, just leaving this 1. And then we can also set the visibility of this to false. Now we're pretty much done with the GUI. The last thing that we're going to actually do is go to the screen GUI itself called pet crafting. Make sure that we set reset on spawn to false. And then we're also going to set the Z index behavior to global. And now that we've done that, we're pretty much done with creating this GUI. So we're going to set the enabled property to false. Now, before we can begin scripting, we are going to want to get the assets that are completely free from my Patreon on this post. There's going to be a link down below in the description, which you guys can click on. It'll take you to this page, and you're just going to click on the assets.zip and download that file. Like I said, this is completely free. Everybody can access it. You don't have to worry about paying any money at all. Now that we've downloaded that file, inside of that file, we're going to have a couple of other files, which are going to be .rbxm files that we can either drag and drop or insert directly into Roblox Studio. So I'm going to insert the pet crafter, and to do this, I'm going to right click on the workspace service inside of our Explorer, click on insert from file, and then I'm going to select my pet crafter. Now, once I've done that, you should see that it gets put directly inside of your workspace somewhere, and we can see it right here. Now, the most important part about this model is, well, first of all, the name. It should be named specifically pet space crafter. The name is very important, and make sure that if you do change it, you remember exactly how you have it saved, especially if you replace the space with no space. So make sure that you remember exactly how you have it named. Otherwise, you're going to run into issues while scripting. Additionally, all the parts in here should be anchored. Otherwise, they're going to fall all over the place. And then additionally, I made all of the parts collidable except for the hitbox, which is just this invisible box around the actual model. And as usual, we're going to use this hitbox part to detect whenever a player steps close enough to the pet crafting station to actually open up and display the GUI. So I'm going to make sure I set that back to transparent. And that's pretty much all you have to worry about with the model. If you did download it from my Patreon and you don't plan on making any changes, then you don't have to worry about that. But I did want to explain some of the key points that you should know when using these models. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to decide where I want this pet crafter to be. Do you want to make one in the spawn area? Do you want to make one on just specific islands like the Arctic island or even the forest island or the volcano island? You can decide all of that. But what I'm going to do is put one on our Arctic island, and then I'm going to duplicate that, and then I'm going to put this one on the volcano island. Cool. So now that we have both of those positioned where we want them, let's make sure that we drag them in their respective folders. So I'm going to put that pet crafter in the volcano folder and that pet crafter inside of the Arctic folder. And now that we've done that, we can start scripting. So to begin scripting, we're going to create the pet crafting config module. So inside of the replicated storage, inside of our configs folder, we're going to add a brand new module script, and we're going to rename this to pet crafting. Now, once inside of here, we're just going to rename the variable to pets because it's just a simple variable that we're only going to be using in the script anyway. Then we're going to create a variable for the replicated storage. And once we have the replicated storage, we also want to get the pets config as well, which of course is inside of the replicated storage. So replicated storage.configs.pets. And the first thing that we're going to start off is by actually creating our config. So we're going to create a local variable called config, which is going to be equal to a blank table. Now, how our table is going to be set up is first we're going to have area names as the keys of this table. So for instance, I'm going to say Arctic, and that's going to be equal to a table. Now, with this table, we actually want to make this table into an array. So it's not going to have keys and values. It's only going to have values. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make another table inside of this table. And now the properties of the specific table are going to be price, and that's going to be equal to another table. And then we're also going to have reward, which is also going to be equal to another table as well. Now, the properties of both of these tables are going to be relatively the same. So the first property that we're going to create is called pet, and that's going to be the name of any of the pets in our game. So we're going to say dog. Then we're going to have a property for rarity, and we're going to set that to whatever rarity the pet needs to be to actually craft the pet. So we're going to say common. Then finally, we're going to add a property called amount, and we're going to set that equal to 4. And the amount variable is going to be used to tell us how many of this specific pet we actually need to craft whatever is going to be inside of this reward table. Cool. So now we're done with that price for right now. Then we can move on to the reward table. And again, inside of the reward table, we're going to have a pet field. This one's going to be called cat. So we're going to be trading 4 common dogs, and we're going to get a cat in return for them. Now the rarity, we'll say rare. And we can also specify the upgrade here, which would either be golden or shiny. And you don't need to specify an upgrade here, but you can. So if we do want to give the player a golden or shiny pet, we can do that. So let's go ahead and just kind of add that there to test that out. And now with that being done, we've created our first crafting table. So anytime we open up the GUI inside of the Arctic zone, this first possible craft will be displayed to us. Now let's create a second one. So we'll put a comma after here, and then we'll just copy and paste that table once again. Now we're going to keep all the properties basically the same. We're just going to modify the values of them. So we still have price, and for pet, we'll say cat this time, and we'll take a common cat, and we'll also require those cats to be shiny. So we're going to require 4 common shiny pets to craft. Let's go ahead and craft a pig, which is going to be the epic rarity, and we're actually going to not include any upgrades with that pet. So now we have 2 pets that can possibly be crafted inside of the Arctic zone. To give us a slight better understanding of these specific tables and also auto-completion for type checking and stuff like that, let's go ahead and actually create the type of this up here. So we're going to say export type, and we're going to call this the pet crafting config, and that's going to be equal to a table. Now inside of this table, we're always going to have a price, which is going to be another table, and inside of this table, we're going to have a couple of properties. So we're going to have the pet property, which is of course going to be a string. We're going to have the rarity property, which is of course going to be a string. We'll also have the upgrade property, which is actually going to be pets config dot pet upgrade. We'll also have the amount property, which is going to be a number. And now some of these properties can be optional. So for example, the upgrade can actually be optional because we don't always need to include the upgrade information inside of here. Now after our price table, we also have a reward table, which is of course equal to another table, and then we need to set some properties inside of here. So the first property is of course going to be pet, which is going to be a string. Then we have the rarity as well, which again is going to be a string. Then we have upgrade, which we're just going to copy and paste that, which once again can be optional. And that's all the properties that we're ever going to have inside of the reward table. Cool. Now that we've made that type, let's go ahead and add this config to the module so that other scripts can actually use it. So we're going to say pets.config equals the config variable right there. And now we're going to create a function inside of here as well. And this function is going to be called get crafting config, which is going to accept an area, which is going to be a string, as well as an index, which is going to be a number. And this is actually going to return the pet crafting config, or nil. Now inside of this function, we're going to create a variable called area config, and we're going to set that equal to pets.config and index that with the specific area. Now, if for some reason we don't actually get a config for that area, then we want to stop the function right there. After that, we want to go ahead and get the crafting config, which is going to be equal to the area config, and then we want to index that with the index. And then finally, once we get that variable, we are going to return whatever that is equal to. Now, you might be confused about what index actually is, but like I said, this table itself is an array. So all the values inside of here do not have keys for them. Only dictionaries have keys because that has keys and values. When it comes to an array, everything inside of an array just has an index, and it's basically like counting numbers. So that's why we use the index to index this table and get whatever specific crafting config that we're actually looking for. Then what we're going to do is create another function below the one we just created, which is going to be called get pet instance. And we're going to accept an area as well as an index, which of course is going to be a number. And then we're also going to accept a mode as well. And our mode is going to be a string, and it's going to either be price or reward. Now we're going to be using this function anytime we basically want to build the pet, which is going to be the price or the reward. And we need to create this kind of custom function because a lot of the functions from our pets config actually requires us to pass through a pet instance. But considering these pets aren't our usual pet instances, which also have UUIDs and other properties attached to them, that's why we have to create this custom function. So we're going to create a variable called crafting config, and that's going to be equal to pets.getCraftingConfig. And we're going to pass through the area as well as the index. Now, after we get the crafting config, what we then want to do is create a variable called pet instance, which is going to be equal to a table. And now inside of this table, we're going to set a couple of the properties. So we, of course, have the UUID property, which is going to be equal to a blank string. We also have the model property, which is going to be equal to crafting config, index that with the specific mode. And the mode variable is going to be equal to price or reward. So just to make this a little bit more clear, this table right here is our crafting config. So when we index this with the specific mode, we're then going to get either the reward or the price table. And then then once we get that pet table, we then want to get the pet property from that table. Cool. So now that we set the model, let's then go ahead and set the rarity, which is going to be equal to crafting config, index that with mode, and then get the rarity property. We then have if it's golden, so we're going to say golden is equal to crafting config, index that with the mode as well, and then we're going to check if the upgrade is equal to golden. We'll then duplicate that line, and now we're going to create the shiny property, and then we'll check if the upgrade property is equal to shiny. Cool. So now that we've created that pet instance, the final thing that we want to do is return it. And there we go. We just returned the pet instance. Then we're going to create one more function inside of here. This one is going to be called canCraft. This is again going to accept an area as well as an index, and finally the player's data. So let's go ahead and get our crafting config, which of course is equal to pets.get crafting config, and pass through the area as well as the index. Now that we've got that, let's go ahead and get the pet instance. So pets.get pet instance, pass through the area as well as the index, and then we want to get the price here. So this pet instance is going to be the price pet. And now that we've got that pet instance, we can then get all the duplicate pets. So we're going to say duplicate pets is equal to pets config.get duplicate pets, and then we want to pass through the pet instance as well as the player's data. Now that we've got the duplicate pets, we then are going to create a variable called canCraft, and that's going to be equal to the amount of duplicate pets is greater than or equal to the crafting config.price.amount. And now that we check if the player has enough or more duplicate pets than the amount required, then we're going to return that result. Awesome. And now we're pretty much done with our pet crafting config. Now that we've done that, before we can begin scripting the GUI, we actually have to extract a function out of one of our other scripts and put that into a module script, so both this system and the previous system which used that function can both use it directly from the module script rather than rewriting the same function 2 times. Now the function that I'm actually referring to is inside of our pet index. So to get this, we're going to go inside of the star player, inside of the star player scripts, open up the GUI folder, and then we want to open up the pet index script. Now inside of here, we actually have a function called get hidden pet model, and we actually want to use this in our pet crafting system. So let's go ahead and move this function from this local script and put it into its own module script so that both of the scripts can use the same function. So what we're going to do is highlight all of that, hit Control X to take it directly from that local script. We're then going to go into the replicated storage inside of the client folder and open up the pet utils module script. And inside of here is where we're going to paste the brand new function. We'll then say pet utils dot the function name. And now that we've added that function here, we then need to update our pet index script. So inside of the pet index local script, we're going to get the pet utils module script, which is inside of the replicated storage .client .pet utils. Cool. Now that we've got that, let's look for any of the errors. And right here is our first one. So we are going to say pet utils dot get hidden pet model, and we're going to still pass through the dog for right here. Then we also use the function down here as well. So let's go ahead and copy and paste that directly right there. And now we fixed every instance inside of the script which actually uses that function. So we're all good there. And we're also done inside of the pet utils module script, so we can close that as well. Cool. So now let's actually start scripting the GUI. Inside of the start player, inside of the start player scripts, inside of our GUI folder, we're going to add a brand new local script, which is going to be called pet crafting. Now inside of here, we're going to want to make a ton of our usual variables. So I'm just going to copy a bunch of these from the pet inventory, and I'm going to paste them directly inside of pet crafting. Now inside of here, we do need the viewport model, but we do not need the format number module. We do need the state manager, and we do need the pet utils as well as the pets config. And we also need a remotes variable as well. Let's add one more variable to this, which is going to be the pets crafting config, and that's inside of the replicate storage .configs.pet crafting. Now that we've added that variable, below that we still have the player variable as well as the player GUI, which we're going to use both of those. We do not need the left GUI, nor do we need the open button variable, so we can delete them. For our GUI variable, we actually want to get the pet crafting screen GUI instead of the pet inventory, and then we have our frame variable as well here, which we're going to still use. Now let's go ahead and create a couple of other variables. So the first variable that we're going to create is called container, and that's inside of the frame, so frame.container. Then we'll create a variable for the exit button, which is just frame.exit. And then after that, we're going to create a variable called current area, which is going to be string or nil. So that's why we're going to add the question mark to that. And now we're pretty much good with all of our variables. Now we'll start off by scripting the activation of this GUI. And how are we going to activate that? Well, whenever a player gets close enough to the pet crafting model, then we want to display the GUI. So we're going to create a function called generate part. Now inside of this function, we're of course going to loop through all of the descendants inside of the workspace get descendants. Now as we're looping through here, the first thing that we want to check is if the name of the descendant is equal to pet crafter. Now remember when I said earlier in the video, the name is very important, so make sure this string is equal to the pet crafter's actual name if you modified it at all. And additionally, our descendants variable is plural here. It should just be descendant, because obviously when we're going through a loop, it's just a single object, not multiple. Anyways, if we do find a descendant with the name of pet crafter, then we know that's the model that we're actually looking for, so we can start scripting that. So we're going to say descendant.primary part, which the primary part is going to be that hitbox part that's inside of there, and we can listen to the touched event, and we're going to connect that to an anonymous function. Now, this anonymous function is going to have an other part argument, which is passed to us every time a part touches this part. Then we're going to create a variable called player, which is going to be equal to players get player from character. And then we're going to pass through the other part dot parent. Now, if we do get a player and that player is equal to the local player, aka our client, then we can actually enable the GUI. So we're just going to say GUI.enabled equals true for right now. Cool. Now that we've created that function, we can actually go ahead and call it right below here. Now, considering we can have a pet crafter in multiple different areas inside of our game, we're going to basically regenerate the entire GUI every single time it's displayed to the player. So let's go ahead and actually create a function above our generate part function called generate GUI. Now, this generate GUI function is actually going to accept one argument, which is going to be the area. Now, going back to our generate part function, how do we actually get the area? Well, let's create a variable called area, and that's going to be equal to descendant.parent.name. So if you're confused by the descendant.parent, basically inside of our workspace, we have the islands folder. Inside of the islands is where we actually have the pet crafter model. So right here is the pet crafter model, and imagine we found that in our for loop. Then we look at its parent, and then we get the name of the parent. And that's how we figure out the area that the player is actually in and where they're trying to upgrade the pet from. So that's how we're going to get Arctic and Volcano and anything else like that. So that's how we get the name of the area. And once we get that area name, what we want to do is we want to set the current area variable that we have to that specific area, as well as call the generate GUI function and pass through the area that way. Now, going back to our generate GUI function, we can then start creating and generating our template frames. Now, to get what frames we actually need to generate, we need to get the pet crafting config. So what we're going to do is we're going to loop through that. We're going to say for index, comma, pet crafting config, and we can cast it to the pet crafting config dot pet crafting config in pet crafting config dot config and index that with the specific area. And then we're going to loop through that. Now, as we start looping through that, that's when we're going to do all the work by duplicating the frames and customizing them how they should be. So let's go ahead and create a specific function to handle that. We're going to create a function called create frame, which is going to accept a crafting config, which of course is going to be of the pets crafting config type. So pets crafting config dot pets crafting config. We also want to get the area as well as the index, which is of course going to be a number. Now that we've created that function, the first thing that we're going to do is actually clone the frame. So we're going to set our clone variable equal to container dot template, and then we want to clone that. Then we of course want to parent that clone back to the container, and we want to set the visibility of it equal to true. After that, let's then create a variable for both the price and the reward pet and see if they are unlocked. So we're going to say local is price pet unlocked, and that's going to be equal to state manager dot get data dot pet index, and then we're going to index that with the crafting config dot price pet. Now, if you're confused by this at all as to how we're checking if a specific pet is unlocked, realistically, it would be preferred to make this function inside of the pet's config, considering we're not just using this for the pet index, but we're also using this inside of pet crafting as well. And you might not remember how we can tell if a pet is unlocked unless you look back at your pet index coding and saw how we did it there. So realistically, we could put this functionality inside of the pet's config module script and then use it that way, but I'm just going to continue through it this way because that's how I'm already doing. Anyway, now that we know if the price pet is unlocked, now we need to check if the reward pet is unlocked. So we're going to say dot reward, and then we're going to rename this variable from is price to is reward pet unlocked. Now that we've checked if both of those are unlocked, we then want to get the pet instance for both of them as well. So we're going to say local price pet instance equals pet crafting config dot get pet instance. And we're going to pass through the area as well as the index and price as the mode argument. We can then go ahead and copy and paste this line, and then we're just going to change everything to suit the reward pet. So we're going to say price reward instance, as well as pass through reward for the argument there. Now that we get the instance, we can actually also get the pet's model. So we're going to say local price model equals if is price unlocked. So if the pet is unlocked, then we want to display a specific model, but if the pet is not unlocked, then we want to display another model. So if the price pet is unlocked, then we want to display petconfig.get model and pass through a price pet instance. Otherwise, we want to get that hidden model. So we're going to say petutils.get hidden model, and then we're going to pass through the crafting config.price.pet, because for this function, we actually just pass through the pet's name. And now that we've done that for the price pet, we can also do that for the reward pet as well. So we're going to update that. We'll also use the reward instance, and I actually really messed that name up here. So let me rename this variable. We should actually call this reward pet instance, not price reward instance. So yes, we have the price pet instance and the reward pet instance now, and let's update the variable usage right there. And then also we want to check if the reward pet is unlocked. So is reward pet unlocked. And then we also want to call this reward model as well instead of price model. Cool. So now we've got both of those models. We can display them inside of the frame. And if this is confusing at all for you, it should make it a lot easier to understand by going inside of your starter GUI and actually looking at the pet crafting GUI. So if we look at the template, we have these two frames right here called price and reward. And if we look in both of those, they have the viewport frames as well as some text labels and even a button inside of them as well. So now that we have that open and we can kind of more so visualize what we're working on and what we're scripting right now, what we want to do is we now want to display those pet models inside of the viewport frame that they belong in. So we're going to use our viewport model module, and we're going to call the generate viewport function on this, and we're going to pass through the clone.price.viewport frame as well as the price model, and then we want to pass through cframe.angles 0, math.rad -90, 0, so that the pet faces the direction that we want it to. And now that we've done that for the price, let's then also go ahead and do that for the reward. So we're going to use the reward model, and then we want to still do the same angles as we always do. Cool. So now the viewport frames have been taken care of, and then we got to start updating the text labels. So we want to create a variable called duplicate pets, and that's of course going to be equal to petsconfig.getDuplicatePets, and we want to pass through the price pet instance as well as the state manager.getData. Now that we've got the duplicate pets, we want to get the amount that is required to craft the pet. So we're going to say amount to craft. And that's of course going to be equal to craftingconfig.price.amount. Then we want to create a variable called canCraft, and that's of course going to be equal to the amount of duplicate pets is greater than or equal to amount to craft. Now you might be thinking, why are we creating a variable and doing the same work here when we already created a function inside of our pets crafting module for canCraft? The reason for that is because even though we've already created that function, it's so simple to do the same work here, but at the same time, we also need to know the amount of duplicate pets that the player has because we want to display them in our amount text label for the price. So that's why we still need to get the amount to craft anyway. We might as well just do the canCraft calculations here because it's so simple. Now that we've gotten all that information, we also have to handle if the pet is upgraded or not. And how we're going to do this is by getting the current pet's upgrade. So we're going to create a variable called price current upgrade. And that's going to be equal to petsconfig.getCurrentUpgrade, and we're going to pass through the price pet instance. Then, of course, we're going to do the same thing for the reward, so reward pet instance and reward current upgrade. Now that we've gotten both of their current upgrades, we can start updating all of our text labels and even modify our craft text button. So first, we'll update the visibility of the question mark inside of our price frame. Now, we only want to display the question mark if the pet is not currently unlocked. So not is price pet unlocked. We also want to do the same thing for the reward pet, so is reward pet, and then we want to update the visibility of the question mark inside of the reward frame. Now we can update the upgrade text label. So we're going to say clone.price.upgrade.text equals, and now we can use our price current upgrade variable, or we're just going to use a blank string, because if the pet isn't upgraded at all, then this function is just going to return nil. And the text cannot be set to nil, it has to be set to a blank string instead. Now that we've updated the price, let's also go ahead and update the reward as well. So we'll say reward current upgrade. Then after that, we'll update the amount text label inside of the price frame. So we'll say clone.price.amount.text equals, and now for the string inside of here, we're going to display the amount of duplicate pets the player has, separated by a slash, and then on the other side of the slash, we're going to display the amount to craft. And now that we've updated that amount text label, the last thing that we have to do is actually update the background color of the craft button. So we'll say clone.reward.craft.background color 3 equals, now if the player is able to craft the pet, then this button should be a nice yellow color, but if the player is not able to craft the pet, then we want to make that a gray color. So we're going to say if can craft, then color3.from RGB, and we'll use a nice yellow color, but we might want to make it a little bit darker, so something like that. Otherwise, we'll say color.from RGB, and then we're just going to use a gray color. And now that we've updated all those text labels and buttons and everything else like that, we then can listen for the craft button to actually be clicked upon. Now, we only want to listen for it to be clicked upon if the player is able to craft the pet when they open this GUI. So we're going to say if can craft, then. And if they can craft, then inside the reward frame, we have that craft button, and we're going to listen to the mouse button one click, connect that to an anonymous function. Now, in order to craft the pet, it's actually really simple. Of course, what we need to do is use a remote event to communicate from the client to the server and tell them, hey, we want to craft this specific pet. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, of course, like I said, we're going to use a remote event. Currently, we did not add the remote event to our game, but we'll do that after we finish all the client-side stuff and then start swapping over to the server-side stuff. I just don't want to interrupt the middle of our flow of scripting. So we'll say remotes.craftPet, and that's what our remote event's going to be called, craftPet. And we want to call fire server, and we want to pass through the area as well well as the index of the specific pet crafting config. So whenever the craft button is clicked upon, if the player is actually able to craft the pet, then this remote event will be fired and will notify the server, hey, we actually want to craft the pet, so start doing that. Cool, and now we're finished with creating the create frame function, so we can actually call that inside of generate GUI. So we'll call create frame. We'll pass through the pet crafting config as well as the area and the index as well. Now, like I said, this GUI is regenerated every single time the player opens it because they can open it from a bunch of different areas. So every single time we generate the GUI, we always need to make sure that we delete all the things that were previously generated. So let's go ahead and create a function towards the top called clean container. And inside of this function, we're going to loop through all the children inside of the container. So container get children do. And if the child is a frame and the child is visible, so the child can actually be seen, then we want to go ahead and destroy it. And now that we've created that function, we can then call this inside of generate GUI as the first thing that actually happens. And now we're done with the generate GUI function. The next thing that we'll script, and one of the last things, is the exit button. So exit.mouse button one click, connect, anonymous function inside of there. And of course, whenever we click the exit button, we want to set the GUI to no longer be enabled. And additionally, we also want to set the current area variable to nil because we're no longer in an area as the GUI is no longer active. Now you're probably thinking, why does this current area variable actually even matter? We haven't really used it this entire time. Well, that's actually going to be used when we listen to the upgrade pet remote event being fired. And let's do that now. So we're going to say remotes.craftPet.onClient event connect, and we're going to connect that to an anonymous function. Then we're going to say task.delay 0, and then another anonymous function. And if the current area variable is set, then what we're going to do is we're going to call the generate GUI function and pass through the current area. Now, like I said, we have not created the craft pet remote event, so don't worry about that if you're wondering when did we create this at all. Additionally, you might be a little confused about how this is going to work. Basically, whenever the player crafts a pet, what we're going to do is we're just going to regenerate the entire GUI. And when we regenerate that entire GUI, it's going to update all of those text labels and everything else like that that needs to be updated. Usually what we do in a lot of our other GUIs is we're constantly updating the GUI. If, say, for instance, the player gets a brand new pet, then we would update the GUI. But realistically, there's no need to actually do that, in my opinion, because players shouldn't really be receiving pets when they're literally in the middle of the pet crafting GUI. It's not like the player should be hatching a pet as they're looking at the pet crafting GUI, and if they are, then they just need to reopen it for it to update. Anyways, with that all being said, this entire thing has been scripted on the client side, so now we can go ahead and move over to the server side. Although, like I said, before we move over to the server side, let's go ahead and actually create that remote event. So inside of the replicated storage, inside of the remotes folder, inside of the pets folder, let's go ahead and add a brand new remote event, which is going to be called craft pet. And now that we've created that remote event, anywhere that we actually use this remote event on the client side is all good to go now. Cool, so now let's go to the server script service and open up our pets module script. We could make a brand new server script inside of the server script service called pet crafting, but at the same time, it really is unnecessary because we're just adding one function to handle the pet crafting. So that's why I'm going to add that inside of this pets module right here. We're going to go towards the very bottom and we're going to add a brand new function. This function is going to be called craft pet and it's going to accept a player as well as the area, which is going to be a string, and the index, which is going to be a number. And let me fix my player type real quick. There we go. Now, of course, we are going to go ahead and get the player's profile. So player data dot profiles and index that with the specific player. If we're not able to find the profile, then stop the function right there. After that, let's go ahead and get the crafting config. And we should have done this first, but I actually forgot. Go to the top of the script and we need to get that pet crafting config. So we'll add that here, pet crafting, and rename this variable to pet crafting config. Cool. Now going back to the craft pet function, we then want to get the specific crafting config, which is going to be equal to pet crafting config dot get crafting config. And we want to pass through the area as well as the index. Now, if we're not able to find that crafting config, then we want to stop the function right there. After that, we then want to check if the player can craft the pet. That's going to, of course, be equal to pets crafting config dot can craft, and we'll pass through the area as well as the index and the player's profile dot data. And if the player is not able to craft, then we just want to stop the function right there and do nothing. After that, let's go ahead and get the price pet instance, and that's of course equal to pet crafting config dot get pet instance, and we're going to pass through the area as well as the index, and for the mode, we're of course going to say price. Then we want to get the duplicate pets that are inside of the player's inventory, so pets config dot get duplicate pets and pass through the price pet instance as well as the profile dot data. Then we'll create a variable for the amount to craft, and that's of course equal to crafting config dot price dot amount. Now we can actually take some logic for how we delete all the pets when we call the upgrade pet function. So we're going to create a variable called amount deleted. We're then going to loop through them and then delete the pets and do stuff like that. So I'm just literally going to copy this for loop and paste it directly down here. So yes, we want to create the variable amount deleted, and then we want to loop through all the duplicate pets. Now the only thing that we actually need to check here is if the amount deleted equals the amount to craft. And if those numbers are equal, then we want to stop the for loop right here because we deleted enough pets. And then below that, we're still going to delete the pet as usual, and we're going to add 1 to the amount deleted variable every time we delete a pet. Now, after we've deleted enough duplicate pets to make the trade work, we're then going to create the pet that the player is going to be rewarded with. So we're going to say local pet instance equals pets dot create pet, and we're going to pass through the crafting config dot reward dot pet. We'll also pass through the crafting config dot reward dot rarity, and then we actually want to update this function because we want to be able to pass through its upgrade as well if there is any. So going to this function, we'll add another argument here, which is called upgrade. And that's going to be of the pets config.pet upgrade type. And we're going to put a question mark here because that property is optional. We might not always pass that through because they might not always be that way. But we also need to update this return statement right here as well to include golden and shiny. So shiny is going to be equal to upgrade equals shiny, or upgrade equals golden, because remember, if the pet is golden, then they are also shiny as well. Then after that, we're going to say golden, and that's going to be equal to upgrade equals golden. Cool. And now that we've updated that, we can go back down to our craft pet function. And now we also have to pass through the upgrade of this function as well. So crafting config dot reward dot upgrade. And then finally, once we get that pet instance, we then need to give the player the pet. So pets dot give pet. And we want to pass through the player as well as the pet instance. And now that we've done that, let's go ahead and fire off that craft pet remote event. So fire client, and we're just going to pass through the player because we're not going to pass through any additional arguments. And now we're done with creating this function. We actually have to call it. So let's go down here and we're going to say craft pet, and we're going to connect that to the craft pet function just like that. Now with that all being said, we're pretty much done with scripting this entire system. So let's go ahead and test this out. Spawning into our game, we can go ahead and look at our crafting system right here. And when we look at it, we can see the pets needed. We need 4 dog pets. And for this trade, we need 4 shiny cat pets, and the reward for 4 dogs is a golden cat, and the reward for the 4 shiny cats is a pig. Now let me go ahead and give myself a couple of dog pets. So let's go ahead and just give ourselves like 6 and reopen this GUI. And now when we reopen this GUI, we can see that we have 5 out of 4 dog pets, and the craft button is now yellow. So if we go ahead and click on this, we can see that we now have 1 out of 4 dog pets, and we're no longer able to craft a golden cat pet. And if we look at our pet inventory, we can see that we've been given a golden cat pet. So we know that that's working perfectly. Now there's 2 final things that we want to kind of update to finish this whole thing off. The first is inside of the pets config. So let's go inside of here, and then let's actually go down to the get duplicate pets function. Now inside of this function, the very last check that we do is if we check if this pet instance dot shiny is not equal to this pet instance dot shiny, and we also do the same check for golden as well. Now the issue with this actually stemmed from our create pet function on the server side. Originally, when we implemented shiny and golden, we still did not set those properties inside of our create pet function. So all of our pet instances just had shiny and golden set to nil if they weren't a golden or shiny pet. But since we've updated the system and now the shiny and golden value should be set to false instead of possibly being nil, that sort of breaks this function right here. But don't worry, fixing it is really simple. What we're going to do is we're going to say if pet instance dot shiny and not pet dot shiny, and we're going to surround that in a parentheses. And after that, we're going to say or if pet instance dot golden and not pet.golden, then we're going to continue through the for loop as we usually do. So now we're checking if the pet instance is shiny, but the original pet is not shiny, or if this pet instance is golden while the original pet is not golden. And since we check that, we also have to check the exact opposite as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy and paste this, and then we're going to say if the pet instance is not shiny, but the pet is shiny, or if the pet instance is not golden, but the pet is golden, then we're going to continue through the for loop as well. And now that we've done that, this function's all good to go, and all the pets are going to be compatible as they should have been. The other last touch that I want to add is actually to the GUI script. So going back to the pet crafting script, all we want to do is go to the generate part function, and inside of here where we actually display the GUI, when we check if the player is actually equal to the local player, we also want to make sure that the GUI is not enabled as well, because we're kind of pointlessly regenerating the GUI over and over and over again. So the only time that the GUI will generate if it's not enabled and if the player is the player that they should be. With all that being said, we can go ahead and test this out one more time. So hopping directly into our game, let's go ahead, go over to this GUI and touch it, and now we can see that all of our old dog pets which weren't working before are actually working now, and we're able to craft the golden cat pet. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, with that being said, that's going to be it for this episode. As always, if you guys did enjoy or the video did help you out, make sure you smash the like button, also the subscribe button, and turn post notifications on so you get notified every time I upload a brand new episode. I also have a Patreon if you guys like to support me and gain access to all the scripts and the game file that I made during this episode. There's a link down below in the description, and you guys go and check that out. With that being said, I'll see you guys in the next episode.